For almost 3 centuries, the great artists of Europe told stories. Moralistic allegories, historical paintings celebrating great events of the past, sentimental anecdotes with adorable animals and children, the recounting of myths with requisite nudes or nymphs or gods, technically superb paintings, but somehow predictable, artificial, stiff in their presentation. All this would change in 1817 in the little hamlet of Barbizon on the outskirts of the forest of Fontainebleau, southwest of Paris. There is a fascinating document in the Museum of Barbizon, the former Auberge Gant. It is the official registry which all inns were required to keep for the police. This compilation of names, dates, length of stay, and place of origin lists almost every great artist of the 19th century, from Rousseau and Millet, Dupré, Diaz, and Corot, to Monet, Renoir, Sisley, Cézanne, Corot, and Redon. All of them stayed in Barbizon.
Mais les peintres, c'est pas Barbizon qui viennent peindre. Ils viennent ici pour aller en forêt de Fontainebleau.
In the beginning, the painters were mostly students from the École des Beaux-Arts. They were used to working in the studio from memory, and there was a new category for the coveted prize, the Prix de Rome, created in 1817 by the school, the Prix de Rome in historical landscape. There were 2 tests for this prize, a traditional one, the test of the historical landscape, which they knew how to do. Here, the landscape is more of a background than a subject matter. As a topic, you could have Jesus with the Samaritan woman, Mars and Venus, this type of thing. But the second test, much more perverse, was the topic of the tree. That is to say, you might be told to depict Apollo at the foot of a chestnut tree. That became a horrific thing. As much as the students knew how to paint Apollo, they didn't know how to paint a chestnut tree or any specific type of tree. They'd never before been asked. They started to look in and around Paris. And since Fontainebleau was very close to Paris, they went there, because they didn't have any money, as often happens with students. Barbizon was interesting in that the inn, run by the Gann family, was cheap, and the small hamlet was close to the plain and right at the edge of the forest. They had to only cover 500 meters to go to work. There were always 10 to 20 students staying at the inn. Imagine, all of them young, none over 30. They'd awaken in the morning to the foghorn of the only shepherd in the village. The shepherd blew his foghorn, and the sheep and the cows came out of the stables to follow him, and that would wake up all the painters. They'd hurry down the stairs, and Mrs. Gann gave them their coffee and had for each of them in a small bag a very frugal picnic. A liter of red wine, very important. A piece of bread, very important as well. A piece of meat from the day before. A little Swiss cheese. 2 hard-boiled eggs with salt. We do know there was salt, and that was it. Imagine how hungry these young people must have been coming back at the end of a long day. And they'd come back at sunset and open the door. 10 to 20 of these young men making lots of noise because they were carrying canvases in their hands so they could dry, their boxes of colors, the sound of their hobnailed shoes, and often 1 or 2 dogs would come bounding into the house with them. They were so famished, they were so young, they could hardly wait for the meal that had been prepared for them. So they'd sit at the big table and start tapping their plates. It was like the army. They'd eat and drink, bottles all over the table, because they were drinking a lot of bad wine, and at the end of the meal, they passed around a large pipe like Corot's, which was kept in the other room. So everyone was smoking the pipe and talking and joking and carousing until 8 or 9 o'clock, when exhaustion would finally send them up to their dormitory upstairs. And the next morning, it would all begin again.
Over time, something magical happened. As these young artists communed daily with nature, felt the soft morning breeze on their faces, were warmed by the spring and summer sunshine, discovered the rippled reflections of the trees and the water and the ponds, the magnificence of the sunrises and sunsets, they fell in love with nature and its ever-changing aspects. Nature, which first served as a subject of observation, to pass the test of a tree for a school prize, became the object of their fascination, the main subject of their passion as painters. Little by little, the subject matter of the painting, as it was understood by the professors at the École des Beaux-Arts, disappears to be replaced by nature itself. the background for the painting becomes the foreground, indeed becomes everything. They opened the first breach in the fortress of the École des Beaux-Arts, a breach that made it possible for the Impressionists who would come later to go much further with technique.
There were several phases of Barbizon. The first phase consisted of observing nature and bringing it back in bits and pieces. That is to say, one day the painter is going to study an oak tree, yet not create a composition, but little by little. And it was Rousseau who first did it, and then Diaz. They realized that nature did not require anything else. They tried to find a motif in nature and not retouch it, and that was something really new. That was the second phase. The whole composition came from nature. Corot, for example, dared to send to the salon a painting that wasn't retouched at all, which was therefore spontaneous, and the critics reacted in rage. Look at these youngsters. They're incompetent, they're doing spontaneous paintings, they don't work enough. When they started to paint outdoors, these early Barbizon painters were the ones who became aware that light was constantly changing and transforming the appearance of things. They began to render atmospheric effects. They began to leave in the morning with two canvases, one for the morning effects and one for the evening effects. We aren't yet dealing with Monet's haystacks nor with the Cathedral of Rouen, but the idea is there. The possibility for Monet's haystacks has been realized. This was something immensely important, completely new in France. It may not have interested the artists who preceded them, but it fascinated and inspired the artists who followed them.
Barbizon, repito, no representa una ruptura con nada.
The subject matter and compositions that the Barbizon artists chose to paint were not entirely new. Much of it can be seen in 17th century Dutch painting, but what is truly revolutionary about the school of Barbizon in 19th century France is the idea of painting outside. Artists discovered that their work took on a life and an energy more powerful than anything they could create in their studios. The effect was remarkable. It was spontaneous. The same way that music in a concert hall is much more powerful and alive than music recorded in a studio.
We have a very precise date for the Impressionists. 1863. It's the date of the Salon de Refusés, the Salon of the Rejected, and Manet's Luncheon on the Grass. The painting created a tremendous scandal in Paris, and during the summer of 1863, we know that Monet, Renoir, Sisley, they all came to Barbizon, and they met the Barbizon painters. This true anecdote gives you the flavor. Diaz sees a group of young artists along what was called the Cow's Alley, and he approaches one and asks him his name and gets Pierre-Auguste Renoir as an answer. And of course, Diaz proceeds to give him advice. They didn't know exactly what they were coming to Barbizon to do, but what was important is to look at the first paintings done by Monet, Renoir, Sisley. They were truly Barbizon paintings. What is surely evident is that these painters, over time, came to meet the old guard. Millet, Rousseau, Diaz in particular, often took great pleasure in the youngsters who were around the table at the inn. He would pick up a piece of paper or a scrap of wood, and he would splash some colors on it, a little red, yellow, green. Then he would lead them into the forest, promising that they would find this image he held in his hand. And in contact with nature, he would succeed in transforming a formless sketch into a landscape. You can see how important it is. The idea is so modern, and it was many, many years before the development of abstract expressionism.
Between 1830 and 1890, a revolution in landscape painting took place. Until that time, the landscape was a minor genre in art, and therefore neglected by the institution that dictated the canons of beauty in composition. Landscape artists like Courbet, Daubigny, Rousseau, and Corot made nature their subject. By doing so, they were not bound by the conventions of the Academy and could experiment without limits. They invented a new way of painting and found a new audience that was sophisticated enough to appreciate what they were doing.
Today, The amazing adventure of the young painters who came to the little hamlet of Barbizon almost 200 years ago continues. From the Louvre in Paris to the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, the Metropolitan Museum in New York City to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and every major museum of modern art in the world. In the end, the great irony is that in trying to control what and how these students would paint, the Academy sent them outdoors, away from their studios. And what those students experienced out in nature so inspired them, they were driven to create works that would change the face of art forever. These works still eloquently speak to us of their love affair with nature, and just as important, help us to discover through their passionate eyes its extraordinary and ever-changing beauty.